So this topic is about humanitarian logistics and supply chain management, right? So I've involved in some projects about humanitarian logistics and supply chain management, as mentioned by Pak Rocky before. My MSc thesis and Ph.D. Thesis was about blood supply chain. Well, you can argue that it's also about humanitarian logistic and supply chains because it involves human helping human. But I'm not going to focus more on that side, but I'm going to present humanitarian logistic and supply chain management in a general way. Right. So this is the outline for my presentation today. First, I would like to set the scene to introduce you about the context of humanitarian logistic and supply chain, and then the definition. Obviously, it's always useful to start with the definition, and then general concept of humanitarian logistic and supply chain management. And then this is not to confuse with halal logistic and supply chain management because I put H there. And then general supply chain resilience or SCRAS concept because I think this is closely related to humanitarian logistics and supply chain management. And then the relationship between this concept aspects of in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. And then finally, I'll present a little bit about the viable supply chains. This is, I think, the new idea come up from the literature about how the supply chain actually should react on this pandemic, and then self-organized or self-organization towards supply chain resilience. Well, let me start with this picture. I think it's most of you or everyone by now should have been aware about this virus. And there are numerous information, articles, news about this virus. And I will not go deeper into this COVID-19 virus because I think some previous speakers have also mentioned about this virus already and the development of this virus in some countries. But this is just to set the scene that this is very great disruptions, and then it's unprecedented, and this might be arguably the one of the biggest humanitarian disasters in human history. So this has already affected many aspects of our lives, including the supply chain itself and humanitarian logistic and supply chain. But we cannot stop there. This is the big picture that we are facing at the moment, so the COVID-19 pandemic, but we still need to think about something else, that we are actually in this world, we are surrounded by many disasters, if you like, whether that be natural disasters or man-made disasters. So if you might have followed some news these days that, you know, during this pandemic, even we still have some other disasters. In this case, for example, we've got some news about Beirut explosions. Hundreds of people died from these explosions, and then thousands of people injured from these explosions. And as you can see, this is I took this picture from the BBC, and you can see that this happened in the port of Beirut. There was a grain silos there, so they stored ammonium nitrate. And some people actually have warned that this is a dangerous place to store ammonium nitrate, and it might explode anytime. But then somehow they kept, or the company kept, this ammonium nitrate in this warehouse. And this port of Beirut actually cover more than 50% of the import products to the Beirut itself. So the impact of this explosion is quite significant for Beirut itself. And as you can see, that there's an extensive damage reported to many buildings, in these areas. And now people are struggling as well to get some supplies for people in Beirut, because in this particular pandemic as well, we have to be careful, not only to think about how to we deliver the donations, but also how we keep or maintain the health protocol for the COVID-19 virus. And this is another case. So the forest fires in Amazon. If you follow some news as well, in Brazil, the COVID-19 has spread through the rural areas, including in the Amazon areas. And at the same time, they are experiencing forest fire, Amazon fire. So it's been happening continuously in Amazon fires, but it started again, I think a couple of days ago or a couple of weeks ago. And some people were also struggling to cope with this fire, because it adds to their struggle. They cannot breathe because of this, and it's difficult as well to differentiate whether this is a COVID-19 or this is about the fog itself. So this adds another complexity to the humanitarian logistic and supply chain operations. And then this is another one. So it's recently in Greek, and then I think this is in Moria migrants. The fire destroys Greek camp, leaving 13,000 people without shelter. And this is one of the biggest fire as well in the migrants camp. And you can also imagine how complex it is when people or stakeholders try to help them, but at the same time they try to avoid getting infected by the virus. This is another example of floods happening in Indonesia during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is another one, but I mean, this picture was taken in 2007. This is to illustrate that there is a danger as well. We are in Indonesia. We are given a title of the Ring of Fire. So anytime the eruptions of a volcano can happen. So we need to also anticipate these things, and it also adds another complexity to humanitarian logistics and supply chain. But before we go further, what is actually humanitarian logistics and supply chain? Thomas and Kopchak, this is from the Logistics to Supply Chain Management book. They explain that humanitarian logistics is the process of planning, implementing, and controlling the efficient, cost-effective flow of storage of goods and materials, as well as related information from the point of origin to the point of consumption, for the purpose of alleviating the suffering of vulnerable people. So the key here is actually how we actually alleviating the suffering of vulnerable people and maintaining the flow of products and also information. Well, you might ask a question: what's the difference between logistics and supply chain? Well, we can have another session to discuss about what's the difference about logistics and supply chain. But I will use that interchangeably in these presentations. But maybe the key point to understand is that logistics is about the flow of products itself, how to manage the flow of products, and supply chain is more of the adding the information and then relationship between the stakeholders within the supply chain itself. This is just to illustrate for those of you who are not familiar with the concept of supply chain. And we've got, this is more complex. I think Professor Hasanul has already mentioned about some components of the supply chain itself. This is just to illustrate, to give you some illustrations and imagine what the supply chain looks like. So the supply chain is actually just one string going from the initial supplier, tier 3 suppliers, to their tier 2 customers. But if you add more strings, then it creates a supply networks. It becomes more complex. And right in the middle, the black box is actually the focal company. It depends on how you see the supply chain. You can be the retailer, you can be the supplier, you can be the manufacturer, you can be the beneficiaries of the donations if you talk about humanitarian logistics and supply chain. You can be the donors, or you can be the social agencies. And it's interesting to see that they are all interconnected, bringing together the products to people suffering from the disruptions. Well, a humanitarian logistic and supply chain only started to gain more attention after Asian tsunami in 2004. So this is the picture taken in 2005 in Aceh, in Banda Aceh, and well, it was devastating disaster. And before 2004, people did not really think about how to manage the humanitarian operations, logistic and supply chain effectively or efficiently. But after this great devastating disaster in 2004, people, academics, practitioners, and other stakeholders started to think how to efficiently and effectively distribute the products to people in need, and how to manage systematically the humanitarian logistic and supply chain operations. This is a very interesting framework to understand the scope of the humanitarian logistic and supply chain operations. I took this framework from Health Logistics by Kuhner Foundations, and I think practically this is a very relevant and easy to understand. In the center of the framework, we have supply chain actors. I'll describe who are the supply chain actors in the next slides. But this is a central point. So we've got supply chain actors working together, and then surrounding these actors, we need to have certain capabilities: preparedness capability, and then assessment and planning capability during the disruptions. We've got sourcing and resource mobilizations during the disruptions. And then we need to deal, if it's international or global pandemic, international transport and storage, and then in-country transport and storage, which is within the local area, and then last mile distributions. This deals with how we distribute products from the last point in the supply chain to the end customers or to the people suffering from the disruptions. These are the supply chain actors, and this is not an exhaustive list, and you can still add some more lists if there are some people relevant to these humanitarian operations. We've got recipients, so people who are in need of any products during the disruptions, and then donors. We've got national government, we've got local government, humanitarian agencies who are maybe involved in these operations, commercial suppliers, because to some extent we need to source some product as well from people who sell the products commercially, and then military if necessary, and then media also plays a key role in this case to publish and to report what actually happens in the field, and then to give some information about the needs itself from the people. And as you can see, they should actually work together in a system, so to coordinate together, because those actors have a different interest. And if we don't manage the interests there, if there are conflicting interests, obviously it will delay the operations process and then affect people in need. The preparedness is about the notion of risk management, how you actually prepare for disruptions. Well, obviously, some disruptions or some disasters can be estimated. So if you have a cycle of disasters such as volcano eruptions or maybe flood, which happens, for example, annually, and there is no solution at the moment, for example, for this flood, then you can sort of predict what's happening next year. And then you start to analyze what are the risks and how big is the impact of the disruptions. Then you can start to prepare the physical supply chain infrastructure. What about the supplies? What about the storage? What about the transport facilities? And remember that it is not only the physical infrastructure that we need. We need also non-physical infrastructure. What it means is actually it's not enough that you prepare the infrastructure without actually educating people to be collectively mindful about the disruptions that are coming up. So people need to be aware that the disruptions is coming. What do I need to prepare? What if this adds more to the disruptions impacts? And if it's man-made disruptions, then obviously people have to be careful about their actions so that they don't create another disruption. And then we've got assessment and planning. So this is during the disruptions itself. Needs assessment can be very challenging. I'll show you in the case after the slides. And then infrastructure can be damaged by the disasters. Maybe the roads can be blocked and then locked down, and then how we are going about that things. And then the information itself can be challenging. We've got many information, challenging information, and sometimes it's overwhelmed. It's overwhelming. The information is everywhere, and sometimes it's difficult to differentiate which information is valid, which one is not. So we need to understand and integrate all of that information about needs, infrastructure, and using the valid information so that we can assess and plan what are we going to do with these humanitarian operations. Sourcing and resource mobilizations. Well, it is inevitable that in the disasters or in this pandemic, we need some volunteers. And it's not easy to manage the volunteers because they are voluntarily they voluntarily do their work. You don't pay them. Well, some volunteers are paid, but most of them are not paid. So you need to actually maintain the volunteers if you are in charge of these humanitarian operations. What about their accommodations? What about the food for the volunteers, the resource itself? How can you get the food from? And then the national and also local sourcing is also important, especially in this pandemic. The supply chain and the business are disrupted. Local businesses, small businesses are suffering from these disruptions as well. And it's actually important as well to consider that. If we can source locally, then we can also help people or business around us. And then distributions. We talk about transport and storage. How do we manage the transportation modes and what kind of transportation means that we use? And then how do we store our products or the donations? There might be a case of cross-border logistics as well, and there was a case as well discussed in Yogyakarta and I think in Indonesia as well. It was during the difficult time about March or April time during the state of emergency for this COVID-19. There was an issue that importing products from other countries is difficult because mainly that China was disrupted and China could not actually send the raw materials to other countries. And there was also an issue of tax as well. So when you import the products for humanitarian relief, you are also taxed by the government. And that needs to be resolved as well. What about cross-border logistics? And then storage capacity. Do you have the capacity? Do you need to actually provide another additional capacity or surge capacity if need be? And then capability itself. Do you have the capability? Do you have the right protocol if we're talking about COVID-19? And then transport capacity and then transport capability. And last mile logistics, as I said before, we need to understand how to actually distribute it effectively. Do we need the warehouses in some places? Because it can be very chaotic in the case of emergency conditions. And when we talk about humanitarian logistics and supply chain management, it's closely related to the sister concept, if I may call it, the stress or supply chain resilience framework. The supply chain resilience refers to the adaptive capability of the supply chain to prepare for unexpected events, respond to disruptions, and recover from them by maintaining continuity of operations at the desired level of connectedness and control over structure and functions. This is a very important concept, and in fact, this adds to the comprehensiveness of the humanitarian logistic and supply chain management concept, because it's been criticized that humanitarian logistic and supply chain concept does not quite include the recovery or growth phase. But this framework actually adds how we not only being ready for the disruptions and responsive for the disruptions, but also we are actually trying to help people to recover from the disruptions. So in this framework, I took it from Ali et al. 2017 from Supply Chain Management and International Journal. We've got at least 3 different strategies. In the wider perspective, we've got proactive and reactive. So proactive is before the disruptions and reactive is after the disruptions. What should we do? But we've got also some interesting concept during the disruption itself. And people sometimes miss about this. What should we do during the disruptions? We've got concurrent strategy, how we adapt, how we respond to the disruptions itself. Well, the proactive strategy, we can, as I said before, we've got some non-physical infrastructure, situation awareness, how to make people aware about this, the disruptions that is happening or the disruption that is coming or predicted to happen in the future. And the robustness of the facilities, how robust our facilities are, and then increasing visibility is also important. We need to understand where in our system that disruptions or disasters can happen. And then we can also build the security for our system and knowledge management through disruptions. We need to collect, huge amount of knowledge and to understand what should we do when disruption comes. And then concurrent strategy, during the disruptions itself, we need to have the ability to adapt. We increase flexibility, building redundancy. These two are very critical. Why? Because flexibility, we talk about when you cannot source your products from other suppliers, so one supplier or your existing supplier, how easy you can change to other suppliers so that you still can manage to deliver the products to people in need. Building redundancy is also important. If you have multiple facilities or only one facility, if it's broken due to the disruptions, then you cannot do anything. Redundancy means you're creating more facilities, for example, or more warehouses or more production facilities so that when anything happens, you still have some backups. This is interesting. We can also reflect back to the case, for example, the Fukushima disasters in 2011. The whole global supply chain stopped. And there were some delays in the supply for electronics and also automotive spare parts across the globe, because most of the electronic and automotive spare parts were actually centered in the Fukushima itself, and there were no redundancy of the system. So we can reflect back on that the impact of this, of not having redundancy is quite big, but this can also be expensive as well for the supply chain operations, especially for small businesses. Then the ability to respond, obviously collaborations is important with the whole supply chain actors, and also agility, how fast you actually react to disruptions. Then reactive strategy, ability to recover. Do you have contingency planning, or do the supply chain actors have the contingency planning? And obviously learning from the disruptions is important. If it's the perennial disruptions, then you can actually learn from the previous episode of disruptions. What can we learn? How can we do it better in the future? And building social capital is obviously very important. I will highlight some important facts that we found in the context of COVID-19 for humanitarian logistics and supply chain management in Jakarta, Indonesia. This is I took this information from a news from kumparan.com in April 20th, 2020. These are some facts. During the disruptions, it was in the emergency conditions, the state of emergency. For example, we talk about the need assessments. During the disruption, during the pandemic in Jakarta, for example, the daily PPE needs in just one hospital, for example, in this hospital, Dr. Sarjito Hospital, during the COVID-19 pandemic or emergency, they need 134 coveralls, 6,000 surgical masks, and then 95 to 100 units of N95, 700 medical gloves. And it was stated there that it is difficult to estimate the total PPE needs of all hospitals in Jakarta. So we cannot actually calculate how long the current stock is going to last. So it's easy to think about the conceptual level, but down to the practical level, it's actually not easy. There was some chaos in the process of identifying the needs there. And then facilities. During the pandemic, for example, the governments prepared some should prepare some shelters for people coming from the red zone, and then the government and hospital have prepared 27 COVID-19 referral hospitals, 48 non-referral hospitals, 122 clinics, 30 rooms are available for critical patients requiring ventilators. We've got 200 and something rooms for non-critical patients. And in the worst case scenario, they can add up to 150 rooms in certain hospitals. And then we've got, at that time, occupancy rate of 35%. And we did quite reasonably good in the beginning, but we just need to check what's happening now. What about the warehouse for critical supplies? At that time, there was no discussion about the warehouse itself. So distributions were quite challenging because we cannot manage and we cannot identify these products come from which donors and how to actually spread these products equally or optimally to people or to hospitals. Inventory, 60 ventilators have been prepared by the local government, and according to WHO, 16% of the COVID-19 patients required ventilators. And the inventory of medicines is also important. And then we've got PPE, coveralls, and other things. And then at that time, the PPE raw materials were quite expensive, and the ventilators were also expensive. It's difficult to get raw materials, and it was expensive, so people had to innovate the way to make these raw materials, alternative materials, and also ventilators. And what about testing equipment, reagent, and etc.? And then we've got the sourcing problems. At that time, there were irregular supplies from the national government, and sometimes it's only once a week, and it's not regular. They supply 1,000 something coveralls, and then 36,000 surgical masks, 495 masks, 5,000 something non-medical gloves, and then 80 medical gloves. And it's also difficult to get the raw materials, and supply from donor is not reliable. So some donors, they are willing to help, but unfortunately, their quality of the supplies, also masks and also PPEs, are not up to the standard. And many of them are industrial masks supplied by donors, they do not meet the standard medical specifications. Transportation and distribution was another challenge. So PPE distribution is handled by the local government, and there was no system applied by the COVID-19 response team at that time to receive and distribute the donations. So all donations were randomly conducted and distributed. So there were hospitals and clinics experiencing overstock of supplies, whereas others hardly received the donations, and that was the real situations. Information is everywhere again, and often overwhelming. So you can get some information about the PPE needs from WhatsApp. You can get it from the website. You can get it from the radio. You can get it from the televisions, from the newspapers, from telephone, and it's quite challenging to manage those operations. Well, so what is the next stage then? What is the solutions? What can be done if we face that kind of situations in the context of humanitarian logistics and supply chain? This is a very interesting article published in 2020 by Dmitry Ivanov, and this guy is excellent because he published a lot of paper in months. All about COVID-19 and in good journals. And one of the propositions there is actually having what's called as a viable supply chain. So if you can see, this is, I took from his paper in 2020. So in 1990, people talk about, well, how to be responsive in the supply chain. This is obviously in the context commercial, but I think we can also apply this in the context of humanitarian logistics and supply chain operations. So back in 1990, people talk about how to make the operations more efficient and more responsive. And then in 2004, as I mentioned before, the natural disasters and man-made disasters happened. And then people start to think about how to make the supply chain more resilient. And then in early 2010, maybe we started to think about how to deal with climate change and society and economics problems. And this actually, the idea of sustainability, supply chain sustainability, came up. And then another a milestone is about digitalization in Industry 4.0, data analytics era in about 2015. And then now we faced another big disruptions and global disruptions, and maybe one of the biggest in history, about the global pandemic. And it creates a big impact on the supply chains. And Ivanov proposed that the supply chain viability should be enacted during these conditions. It means that the ability for the supply chain to self-organize themselves and then to survive during the pandemic. It's not easy because, well, obviously, most of the supply chain actors were devastated by this pandemic, but the ability to survive and then self-organize themselves and then restructuring their supply chain network is actually critical in this time of pandemic. Well, obviously, agility and then resilience, sustainability, and digitalization are also helpful in this case, but the ability to survive itself in this pandemic is utmost importance. And another things that we can do is actually how we can enact the self-organized social groups. Yeah, I took this quote from Comfort, 1995, about self-organizations, because he actually mentioned about this, how important is self-organizations after the disruptions, how that can actually help during the disruptions and after the disruptions for the recovery phase. So this set of organizations, many of them interacting with one another for the first time during the response operations, had different responsibilities, contributed different resources, presented different interests and groups within the community, but engaged in response operations to serve the larger goal of the community's welfare, and could be identified as a member of the emerging community response system. This is important. It was the case of oil spill, I think in Pillsbury, if I'm not mistaken, in 1994. And after the oil, if I'm not mistaken, if oil spill or something explosion. So we need to check again. But after the disruptions, people gathered together, many organizations and then NGO gathered together to think about how actually we save the community around the area of disruptions. And I think that's important. If we think about the supply chain at the moment in the literature as well, people think about supply chain as a self-induced process. Supply chain resilience is a self-induced process. But in this pandemic, everything is devastated. So people need help. The supply chain actors need help. The business need help. And the social groups are actually capable of doing that. We need to have what's called as social capital. And I'll give you an example, and some of you from Yogyakarta might be familiar with this Sonjo, and this is a self-organized social group. They even created a website, with hundreds of people, over 500 people join in, and it started simply using a WhatsApp group. So people gathered together from academics and then students, practitioners, and then authorities, small businesses, and people gathered using the simple WhatsApp groups and chats. They coordinate everything, and they even help with actually distributing the donations, and also how to help small businesses survive, how to rebuild their supply chain, how to find new customers, how to find new suppliers. And it's amazing how people, when they work together, can actually alleviate this impact of the pandemic. Please check on sonjo.id. I think it's very interesting if you want to learn more about this group. It's amazing. And even they could identify in their database during the pandemic hundreds of small businesses that needs help, and also hospitals, tens of hospitals. I think almost 100 I think about 70 hospitals who need that donations. So building and investing social capital is important, not only for commercial purposes, but also this is during the pandemic when you realize that you cannot do yourself, you cannot commercially run your business or your supply chain, then social capital is also an important way as an alternative to cope with the pandemic. I think that's all my presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to discuss this. Thank you.